This program has been made possible in part by the following sponsors. The Trial Lawyers Association of BC. The Vancouver Courier newspaper. My new book about addictions, All the Way Home, Building Recovery That Works. Well, as right as rain, as often as predictable as Christmas and New Year's, the annual teachers' strike is on. And there are some students, however, who are actually going to school, about 76,000 students. How is that possible? Well, they attend independent schools, and that's a whole story. We thought we'd get a slightly different perspective on this annual Farrago, is that a good word? Farrago? I got to look up that word. Why did that come to mind? Our guest is Peter Froese, who is the boss, I should look at your card, of the Federation of Independent Schools Association of BC.
That's correct.
What's your boss title? CEO?
I'm the executive director.
Executive director. Very, very good. Just explain it. What is the Independent Schools Association? What are some of the numbers?
Okay. The Federation of Independent Schools Association is a group that was formed in 1966 to deal with essentially two issues for independent schools. One was funding, the other one was recognition.
Right.
Things that we didn't have back then.
Yes.
And
now you have both.
Now we have both.
Yes.
That is correct. And what we have in this association is 5 distinct groups of independent schools. And the largest of which are the Catholic schools. They represent about 30% of the 76,000 that you were referencing earlier.
Yes.
Then that's followed by 2 Christian groups of schools, Association of Christian Schools International and Society of Christian Schools of British Columbia, also about 30%.
Wow.
And then we have a collection of schools in a group called Associate Member Group. And the reason we call it the associate member group is because in our structure, you need to have 10% of the enrollment in order to form an association with independent schools.
Right.
But many of these schools want to be a part of the Federation of Independent Schools, so as standalones, they come under this umbrella organization called AMG.
Now, this strike, this annual event, is actually good for your business. Not because people rush to your school today, but it has a positive effect on enrollment for independent schools.
Well, if you look at 2012,
yes.
2012 was a significant job action year in the public sector as well.
Yes.
And our enrollment typically at this time, in an era of declining enrollment for K-12 students,
yes.
For all schools,
yes,
the
yes,
number
yes.
of kids in K-12 is declining.
Yes.
In that time period, we generally continue to rise by approximately 1.5%. In 2012-13, we were at 4%.
Right.
And that was after the job action.
So in 1977, I think it was Bill Bennett, was it not, who started funding independent schools.
That is correct.
And the funding, I think, started at about 4 or 5%?
No, the funding started at 30%.
Oh my goodness.
Okay, so we went from nothing.
Yes.
And it's interesting, if you examine independent schools prior to 1977,
yes.
they were in difficult straits.
Yes.
Our schools were not doing well because the public sector had improved education to such a degree that independent schools couldn't keep up. And financially, they were struggling. So the only option was either to see if we could secure some funding from the government or close our doors.
And what do you think, looking back, why do you think a Socrat government, especially someone as Socrat as Bill Bennett, you know, the face of the social credit, why would he suddenly decide this is a good idea?
Well, interestingly, it wasn't just the So-Creds that supported that. The NDP also supported that
Yeah.
in 1977.
Yes.
I think the issue was one that we had been lobbying the government hard to try and get recognition and funding, and it made legitimate sense. Look, we're providing the same educational program that is being offered in the public sector, and if we're doing it at that time at 30%, that's an incredible deal for the government.
Yes.
If these schools close, where do these students end up? Back in the public sector where they're funded at 100%. So I think there was a little bit of an economic argument, and secondly, it was also a quality of education argument. Our schools were producing good students.
And they have consistently done that.
Yeah,
Independent schools continue to be high achievers.
That's been our perception. It's not, there are some schools that struggle, as there are in all systems, but by and large, we're pretty pleased with the performance of our students in independent schools.
What's the famous 12% number that I keep coming across?
Yeah, I looked at that this morning. I found out it's actually not 12, it's 13.
Okay.
What that means is of the number of K to 12 students in British Columbia,
Yes.
13% of them are educated by independent schools.
Wow.
And we do that on 5.3% of the provincial budget.
Okay, so Billy Smith, age 14, is going to whatever, St. George's or not to Crofton House. Janie Smith is going to Crofton House, I guess. And the Smith family pays for that. Are you telling me that 50% of Billy Smith's tuition is coming from the taxpayer?
In the examples that you used,
Yes.
no.
Oh, because of those two examples.
Because of those two examples only. There are 4 groups of independent schools.
Some
Government
are funded
classification.
higher, yeah.
That is correct.
Yeah.
So the way the differentiation is, if your per student operating cost is equal to or less than that of the public school district in which your school is located,
Yes.
you're funded at 50%. If your per student operating cost exceeds that of the public school district, you're funded at 35. And the 2 examples you used are funded, their per pupil operating cost exceeds that of the public school sector, so they're funded at 35%.
What do the Feldmans, Goldmans, and Feinsteins get at King David?
They're actually a Group 1 school, so they're funded at 50%.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's a pretty good deal.
It's a as far as we're concerned.
It's a pretty good deal for the parents.
Yeah.
I don't know how good, we'll talk about, there's of course always people who are pretty angry about this, but let's leave that for the moment. Let's talk about this job action. Are any of your teachers unionized?
There are approximately 6 of our schools that are unionized,
Yes.
but not with the BCTF. There are some
What kinds of unions do they belong to?
public service unions.
Okay.
So they are unionized. Victoria Catholic School Board, for example, their schools are unionized.
Yes.
And there's a couple of schools here in Vancouver that are unionized as well. But by and large, they form a very, very small minority of our 347 schools.
Yeah, and of those 347 schools, and over the last 40 or plus years, you haven't had job actions.
And I doubt whether we will have job action. That's the nature of independent schools. They are operated by independent authorities.
Yes.
And the intent is, if you close your doors, you're not being very productive.
Yes.
And so the likelihood of a strike within independent schools, even with the few schools that are unionized, is likely very slim.
Off the top of your head, would you say that parents are more or less involved at independent schools than they are in public schools?
Now, that's a very good question, because that's one of the things that people identify as to why they go to an independent school.
They feel they have a bigger voice?
Yeah. Now, my background is I spent 20 years in public education. I have a great deal of pleasure in that. I think it's a great system, and I respect my colleagues who are there.
Yep.
But insofar as parental involvement, our parents say that our they have a better opportunity to involve themselves with the students in an independent school, and the schools are more responsive to the parental concerns. So it's a two-way street there. They're getting better participation.
What's the old saw about the paying the piper? I mean, the school is going to be more responsive because the parents paying the bill, aren't they?
Parents vote
it's
with
a
their
customer.
feet.
Sorry?
Parents vote with their feet if they're not happy.
Yeah. Yeah. So what do you make as a guy who spent 20 years of his working life in the public system and now representing independent schools? What do you make of what I'm jokingly call an annual event? Because all my years in broadcast, it seemed to me this came up almost annually.
Our perspective is that we're disappointed because, first of all, not all students are able to attend an independent school. There's a cost involved.
Yep.
There's a tuition. We're funded at 50 and 35%. The difference is picked up from somewhere, and it generally comes from the parents by way of a tuition.
Right.
So not everyone can afford that extra cost. So we believe that there has to be a strong public education system. Even though I speak for independent schools,
I appreciate that.
we need to have a strong public education system.
Right.
We need our teachers fairly compensated, but it has to be within the means that's available to them within the province of British Columbia.
There seems to be, Peter, a kind of general feeling on the street, and we're getting it in editorials. There was one this morning in The Sun, that both sides of this fight are starting to really tire people out and annoy people. That people are sort of going, yeah, the government has behaved badly, that's true, but would the Federation please shut up and go to work? There seems to be this sense on the street.
Yeah, and for us, our first response is we're so glad we're not involved.
Yeah, I bet.
But from our perspective, we need our schools in operation. It's unfortunate that this has happened at the end of the year, in my view, because it's difficult to leverage your position at the end of the year.
But doesn't this often happen at the end of the year? Doesn't the Fed often pick the end of the year to do this?
The other ones that I'm familiar with, they've happened during the time that the school year is in session, and so there's a bit more leverage on the part.
But now we have this. So now we have this triple dilemma of will there or will there not be summer school?
Yeah, and that affects us. And
how does that affect you?
Well, because independent schools are not permitted under legislation to provide summer school. Oh. And so therefore, if the public sector is not able to provide a summer school, our students are affected because we have students that may require remediation as well in our courses, or we have students that want to take a greater load in their program, and so they pick up one or two in summer school. That gives them a few more options or electives.
But they can't if all their other kids are going to summer school.
Now we can't. And so we're working on an option with the government to see if there is something available to us. It's highly doubtful whether summer school will be available to either public or
Peter, we're going to take
school.
a break in just about a minute. Just off the top, do you have any sense of this coming to a reasonable conclusion in some reasonable amount of time, to this current strife?
My feeling, it'll come to some reasonable conclusion.
Yeah.
Whether it'll be in a reasonable amount of time, that is the question.
Because there is the fear amongst many people that this is going to linger throughout the summer.
If it can't get resolved, in my opinion, if it can't get resolved by June the 30th, it would be my hope that would be the case. If it's not,
it's a Monday.
I'm thinking that's correct.
Yes.
But I'm thinking in that case it's going to drag on into September.
All right, we'll take a little breather. I think I'm going to go back to school. I'm going to go teach at an independent school, and then I can have the summer off. I like this.
Yeah.
Take a little breather. Do send us a note. Email davidberner.com. Always happy to hear from you. And this gives us the opportunity for those nice folks who provide some sponsorship for this program to say hello here on Shaw Community Television Cable 4. Back in just a moment. This program has been made possible in part by the following sponsors. The Trial Lawyers Association of BC. The Vancouver Courier newspaper. My new book about addictions, All the Way Home, Building Recovery That Works. We're so accustomed to Vince Reddy being the magic man and solving these kinds of stressful and cumbersome negotiations, but Harrop had a wonderful cartoon in the paper, was it this morning, that said Vince Reddy isn't. He isn't ready. But there are many of us who, the moment we heard that Mr. Reddy said he was otherwise engaged, we read between the lines and thought to ourselves, I think Mr. Reddy likes to achieve things. He likes to succeed, and this one doesn't look very hopeful. Peter Froese, Froese, Executive Director of the Federation of Independent Schools Association of BC. That's your read as well.
That's my read. Quite honestly, I think the fact that the BC Federation, the Teachers Federation, has gone to request mediation, I think that's a good sign.
Yes.
But the fact that Vince Reddy is not able to pick that up at this time because he's busy, I think we need to read between the lines in that statement that the parties are still too far apart in order for mediation to be successful.
Busy could be
even though both parties had agreed to having him participate.
Busy could be a bit of a euphemism.
Exactly.
So let me tell you about the two people I ran into. Yesterday was a delightful lady who'd been teaching. She's retired now, and she's been teaching 33 years or something, and I won't say where or what. But she's furious at the Federation. She hates this idea. And, because she told me that one of the strikes 10 years ago or whatever, she went to work. She showed up. She crossed the picket line and made her colleagues really unhappy with her. And she said what happens in the schools is that people who have been friends, teachers who have been friends and colleagues and meet in the staff room every day for tea and do, supervise the soccer games and so on, suddenly they're like not very friendly as they take different, sides of this fight.
Yeah, it is divisive, but I think we have to come to the understanding of what is a teacher really all about?
Yes.
Their joy is to teach kids.
Right.
And to see the light go on as far as kids is concerned. And that, in my view, is what's in the mind of the teachers in the public sector as well.
Yes.
They're being pulled away at this point from something that they enjoy doing. And I think that is a cause for anger as well. Whether they direct their anger at the BCTF or whether they direct it at the government,
yes.
I think what they're most upset about is that they're being drawn away from their profession. What they love to do is help kids learn. And it's not possible in this kind of a climate. And I would add one more thing. I think that's one of the issues that has caused some migration of parents from public to independent schools, and that is the politicization of public education.
Yes.
Families are wanting that environment to be a place where the kids can learn. They want a teacher that the kids can connect with and that they want to be able to learn. They don't want the politics to be woven into the educational program. And I think that's a serious problem.
That's a very interesting issue that you raise, because it would take us off on some other tangents, and we'll go there for just a moment, because the politicization of the classroom, I mean, we could do 2 hours about that, because teachers may want to say, tell the students we're not paid enough, or they may want to say you should never accept gays and lesbians, or you should always accept gays and lesbians, whatever their point of view is, or they may want to throw their political point of view into the classroom, and that's always very tricky, very dicey, and sometimes highly questionable.
And that's a concern.
Yes.
We have in the Public School Act, Section 167, that says public education has to be secular and of a non-sectarian nature. And that's again where independent schools is favorable to independent schools, or to parents, because 65% of our schools are faith-based. And so if parents can put their kids into a school environment where the values are consistent with those at the home, that's a really important feature for a lot of parents. And if you're teaching the same curriculum in that context as they're getting in the public sector, that's a huge attraction for many families.
Yeah, and you run into conflicting sets of rights, as the Christian University out in the Valley has.
Correct. Yeah.
So you run into the right of freedom of religious choice and so on, and that clashes with the right to not disparage people's sexuality. Both of these are legitimate rights, and there they are clashing. I mean, Do independent schools find themselves in that kind of soup occasionally?
We do, actually. Those issues are very real because not
Sure.
all schools are faith-based, and some of them have no issue with gays and
Yes.
lesbians in the classrooms. Others might.
Yeah.
And so it's really ironic why the Federation of Independent Schools, which will be celebrating its 50th year in 2016, coming up here very shortly,
Yes. Wow.
we have only identified, of the 5 associations that I referenced, where there's only been one example that we can draw on where we said, okay, we can't agree. We have to take a separate course on this issue. Now that's quite unique given the diversity that you just described quite aptly here. How are we able to do that? How are we able to achieve our, I happened to do my doctorate on exactly that subject at UBC a couple of years ago.
Yes.
And what we concluded was that, first of all of the associations were united on one common theme: funding and recognition.
Right.
Okay, so that's common. Doesn't matter what your particular
Sure.
persuasion is. But then when you drill down a little bit deeper, then you start seeing that there are some examples that are quite unique. If you go back to '66, when the Catholic schools, which had the largest number of students back then, 73%. When FISA was formed at that time, the Catholics could have said, hey, we're the biggest player on the block here. We want the majority of representation on that board of 5 associations.
It didn't happen.
They didn't. They stepped back and said, we'll take identical representation. And that brought a level of trust that wasn't there before. And that trust has been carried on through these years. So it's brought a level of respect for the diversity within independent schools. And we now look at our diversity as our strength. The differences are not something that divide us. The differences,
they're bringing you together.
They're bringing us
Very nice.
together.
So speaking of PhDs, here is E. Wayne Ross, PhD, Professor, Department of Curriculum and Pedagogy. When's the last time you heard the word pedagogy?
We actually use it a fair bit.
My mother used to use it all the time. At UBC, and he calls what you do, independent schools, privatization through the back door. He says, not unlike charter schools in the U.S., public funding of private schools in BC is privatization through the back door. Elite private schools are subsidized by the public, while public schools are told to look to the marketplace and so on. What do you do? I mean, that's a strong argument. What do you do with that argument?
Yeah, and you will hear that argument come up every time that there is job action.
Sure.
Our position is, I think you will find, and the research will support this, that students learn better in an environment where they're comfortable.
Yes.
And I think if you asked parents, did they send their kids? They don't have to send their kids to an independent school. That's purely a choice thing.
Yes.
Did they send them there because they were supporting the government's agenda of privatizing education?
Yeah.
I don't think so. To me, that's a very weak argument. Independent schools are providing an environment where parents and students and teachers can learn within a culture and an environment that makes them feel safe. And that's what you'll hear a lot of families that are coming to our schools now. It's a safe environment. We will never be able to replace public education. Never.
Public funding for private schools is at odds, says the good doctor from UBC, with creating a more equitable, just, and democratic society. Of course, someone argued in the paper the other day that democracy may not be, or maybe I was reading it in an article somewhere, democracy may not be the best deal on earth. What we need is a benevolent monarch.
I would argue that a little bit of competition in education is not a bad thing.
Is this not somewhat like the conversation I keep having with Dr. Brian Day from Canby Surgery? That, you know, there are people who say he's just trying to make more money for himself, and he's saying we're trying to provide a broader, expansive health service.
Yeah, and we would take the same position. Our position is we're providing an avenue of excellence in education for people in our province who choose to do that. And quite frankly, it's an incredible deal for taxpayers of British Columbia when you're paying 50 and 35% of only the operating cost. You're paying nothing for the cost of the buildings and the land and equipment.
So one of my friends, I won't say what he teaches because I don't want to give him away, but he's very unhappy about being on strike, and he's been a teacher for a great, great many years. I think he's probably close to retirement. And he says that this is not about classroom size, and it's not about teachers' wages. He says it's about acquiring more funding for the Federation.
Boy, that's a tough one to answer.
And it's a pretty strong accusation.
See, I believe, from our perspective, we have special needs students within our sector as well. There's 50
Yes.
million that was spent this last year on special needs students within independent schools.
Yes.
So they're there. But I think it would be fair to say that education has definitely become more challenging overall, but especially
Absolutely.
in the public sector.
Yes.
And the type of kids that our teachers are having to face in an integrated environment where we have got special needs in the classroom, we've got emotional challenges, we've got
You got
mental
everything going on.
challenges. It's there.
Yeah, yeah.
And so it's difficult. There's no question. So I empathize, as will our colleagues in independent schools. We empathize with that concern.
I don't
in the
think
public sector.
anybody could get away today with what happened to me when I taught in northern Manitoba, and I was like this tall. And the principal said, "Yeah, we'll give you 9 and 10 math and science, and you might as well do phys ed and choir while you're at it." I don't think schools operate that
No.
way anymore. Thank goodness.
No, they don't.
You can't call this strike. You don't have a prediction. You think you're pretty confident eventually it'll get solved, but you're not optimistic about a quick response.
Well, I wouldn't close the door on a quick response. They have happened.
You'd be happy to see one,
And
I'm sure.
quite honestly, there's an incredibly strong motivator out there. It may not be
Yes.
in a sufficient amount, and that's the bonus, the $1,200 bonus.
Yeah,
I know the BCTF has asked for something
5,000
much
seems
larger.
to me an outrageous request.
But if they could sit down and say, okay, let's pull a deal off on this issue and get that bonus, that's a fairly strong motivator, and it could happen.
Yeah, I think we should get all of the crew and the camera people and you, and we should all look at the camera and say, give Dave a $5,000 signing bonus.
He would like that.
Peter, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Great to have you here. Peter Froese, who is the Executive Director of the Federation of Independent Schools Association of BC. Next week, you think that you're watching me. The question is, am I also watching you? Our guest will be with openmedia.ca, and we will consider issues of privacy and that toy that people can't seem to put down for 4 seconds. Thanks for being with us here this evening on Charlotte Community Television Cable 4. Good night.